So what is the best frame rate? Well, that's a subjective call. Sort of. Let me explain. So what I'm really talking about is the best frame rate for the job. So that means what you're shooting, and also to a degree where you live. And by the way, this is for traditional cameras or smartphone cameras. Being in the US, our broadcast standard frame rate is 30 frames per second, or really 2997. And it's called NTSC. Broadcasters here usually shoot at 30 or 60 frames per second. If you live in a PAL country, in Europe, etc., you shoot 25 or 50 frames per second. Now, when you shoot in the higher frame rates, the 50 or 60 frames per second, they look hyper real. That is what news looks like, or live events like sports, award shows, etc. And then there is 24 frames per second. This is the universal frame rate that you shoot regardless of where you live, and in particular for narrative filmmaking. Now let me tell you what I do, and we'll break it down from there. I shoot everything at 24 frames per second, regardless of the project. And so any other frame rate I choose will be based off that 24. For example, if I shoot 60 frames per second, that means I'm shooting over crank for slow motion. If I shoot 12 frames per second, that means I'm shooting under crank for fast motion. So 24 is the baseline frame rate for everything I do. Now, if you're in a PAL country, you might do a similar thing, but base it off 25. Unless you're shooting a movie. If you're shooting a movie, shoot 24 no matter where you live. Remember, the higher frame rates will look more like video, like soap opera, when you play them back at the same speed. So 50 or 60 played back at 50 or 60 will look like video. The lower speed frame rates, like 24 or 25, will look more like a movie. And of course, 24 is the frame rate that the overwhelming majority of movies are shot at. So when do you shoot the different frame rates? If you're making a movie or a commercial or a documentary or a music video or really anything narrative, shoot 24 frames per second, period. If you're making a YouTube video or a wedding film or a promotional video, also shoot 24 frames per second. Now, I know there are some YouTube channels that shoot 30 frames per second and even 60 frames per second. Don't do it. Not only does it not look as good, but you actually use more drive space. 24 frames per second, you get smaller files. And if you're shooting a lot of footage, that can add up. The caveat here is if you're in a PAL country, you could substitute 25 frames per second for YouTube, etc. But again, not for a movie. Action! As I said earlier, anything I shoot above 24 frames per second is for slow-mo, and that includes 30. So if I'm shooting drone footage especially, or gimbal footage that's B-roll, I like to shoot at 30 frames per second just to give it a subtle dreamlike slow-mo look. And it also takes out some of the bumps too, so it can make it look smoother. Now, if I am doing something for broadcast, I will occasionally shoot 30 frames per second instead of 24. It can make post-production and delivery a little bit easier, although if you shoot 24, you can just add pull down in post-production for 2997 playback. But that's a topic for another video. So again, with 24 frames per second as my baseline, when I shoot 48 frames per second, I'll get a 50% slow-mo look. Same thing if you're in a PAL country and shoot 50 frames per second. Or if you shoot 60 frames per second, you get a 40% slow-mo look. 120 frames per second, you get a 20% slow-mo look. And then 240 frames per second, you get a 10% slow-mo look. And this is incredibly slow. I rarely shoot that slow, but occasionally it can be helpful. Of course, then there's high-end cameras that can shoot 300 frames per second, even thousands of frames per second to get a super high-end slow-mo look. But currently on the iPhone, you can max out at 240 frames per second. As I said at the beginning, frame rate can be subjective, sort of. I would stick to 24 frames per second really for everything. Unless you're in Europe or a PAL country, you can shoot 25. Anything else above or below that would be for slow or fast motion. And if you stick to that, if you do that, your videos will, typically speaking, look pretty darn good. If you'd like to learn more about mobile filmmaking or just filmmaking in general, be sure to check out my courses, not only on my website, but now also on Skillshare. I cover smartphone cinematography, mobile audio production, and also DIY filmmaking. How to successfully make a DIY short film. Links to all these are in the description. Thanks for watching. This is Blake Calhoun. Please like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.